What do I stand for as Secretary of the Navy? Good order and discipline of the United States Navy. That's a prime tenet. This, in fact, erodes that you can get away with things. We have to have good order and discipline. It's the backbone of what we do. I don't think he really understands the full definition of a warfighter.
Welcome back. That was former Secretary of the Navy Richard Spencer on CBS This Morning, speaking out for the first time against the president since he was fired. Spencer was ousted after he pushed back on the president's attempts to influence the military's handling of the case of Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, who was convicted of misconduct but acquitted of war crimes during his tour in Iraq. Instead of allowing the military complete their review of the case, President Trump intervened, first via Twitter, telling the military to, quote, get back to business and allow Gallagher to retire without losing his elite status within the SEALs. So yet another official who stood up to the president is now out of a job. Joining me now to talk more about this striking and very public dispute is former NATO commander and MSNBC analyst, Admiral James Stavridis. Admiral, thanks so much for being here and talking about this with us. This is a really public break. It's rare to see somebody at such a high level in this administration issue a pretty severe resignation letter, but then go on camera and say this was a bad decision by the president.
I think it's unprecedented in this administration. The closest to it, Katie, is Secretary Mattis, who wrote a similarly pretty sharply worded "I'm out of here" letter. But in the case of Secretary Mattis, he went silent. Here we have Secretary of the Navy. That's a very high level position, very publicly saying, I disagree with the president about the need for good order and discipline. And I would say the Secretary of the Navy is on the side of the angels in this one.
Why is it a problem to have the president break the chain of command here?
Well, because it undermines good order and discipline. You can't run a military organization unless people can look up the chain of command and down the chain of command with reliability. And secondly, all of this, let's step back for a minute. This is about pardoning war criminals. And when you do that, you undermine the ability of our soldiers and sailors who are in the field fighting to feel that they can undertake revealing bad behavior. That hurts us.
Is the problem the president doesn't believe in war crimes? I mean, he's been very explicit about what he thinks should happen on the battlefield. And if you need a reminder, we have a few different sound bites from the campaign. Take a look.
See, the problem is, we have the Geneva Convention. We have all sorts of rules and regulations. Our soldiers are afraid to fight.
On the Geneva Conventions and enhanced interrogation, do you think that they should allow for that, given the rise of ISIS?
I am a person that believes in enhanced interrogation, yes. And by the way, it works.
I would bring back waterboarding, and I'd bring back a hell of a lot worse than waterboarding.
And the other thing is with the terrorists, you have to take out their families. When you get these terrorists, you have to take out their families.
Katie, literally everything the president just said is illegal, is a violation of the laws of war, and no military commander would execute those orders. They are illegal orders. If you had ordered me as a four-star commander of the NATO mission, for example, to go kill the families of terrorists, if you had ordered me to torture detainees, I would have refused that order. And by pardoning these war criminals, the president undermines the ability of those to report that kind of behavior.
If you were to talk to the president, how would you tell him that the Geneva Conventions matter? Why do they matter? Why do we have these rules in place? And why is there a structure in place to punish people, publicly punish people who break those rules?
Yeah, for the most pragmatic of reasons, and I'll give you three. One is by behaving in an appropriate way, we hold the high moral ground. We attract allies. We don't drive away our partners, allies, and friends. Secondly, we instill confidence in our people that we are better than our opponents, that we stand for what is right and true and just. And thirdly, if we don't enforce these kinds of Geneva Conventions and all the other conventions, you see an unraveling of the international system. And that is to the detriment of us all.
Is this a break between Donald Trump and military leadership, or a break between Donald Trump and the military as a whole?
Yeah, this is a very good question. President Trump enjoys a slightly higher popularity rating within the military, particularly within enlisted military personnel who comprise the bulk of the force, than in the U.S. population generally. I suspect that is part of his calculus here. However, he is in the wrong place here. The military is not going to support pardoning those who disgrace the uniform, which is what we are seeing here. And I think he's making a political miscalculation alongside a geopolitical miscalculation, alongside a moral miscalculation.
Eddie Gallagher posed with the dead body of a teenage captive that he stabbed.
He did. And he also captioned that saying, "Look at my knife skills." That is not who we are in the U.S.
Is it who we are
Armed Forces.
now with this president?
It is not. It is still a tiny minority of bad actors. They need to be called out. And let me make a point. Eddie Gallagher and the others who are convicted of these war crimes were reported by their peers. This is not the political correctness police who have turned these people in. These are fellow Green Berets, fellow SEALs who have reported, who have adjudicated these cases, and who sit in judgment on them.
Eddie Gallagher on, I guess, the family Facebook page after Spencer was fired, posted a picture of a burning dumpster and said this is the state of naval leadership.
I disagree with that. We have a very good new chief of naval operations. We have, despite Secretary Spencer's departure, we have a very good acting Secretary of the Navy, and we have a very good designated Secretary of the Navy. They will have challenges dealing with the outcome of this.
How do you feel about Mark Esper in all of this?
I think that Secretary Esper, from what I can see, started this in a good place, which is going to the White House, talking to the president. He brought the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He worked very hard to convince the president that these pardons would be a mistake. The president chose to overrule him. At that point, Secretary Esper has a hard decision to make. Evidently, he has decided to execute the orders of the president and stay in the job. I am hopeful that he is doing that, and he's a West Point graduate, and from all I can see, a solid individual. He is doing that in order to continue to work to improve this situation. At some point, this may be untenable for him if there is, for example, a whole series of pardons. Every time we do this, it undermines good order and discipline in the military, Katie.
Admiral James Stavridis. James, thank you so much. Admiral, thank you so much.
Pleasure, Katie.
Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.